It's June 16th, 2010. A seemingly typical summer day in Paris. But Francois Bettencourt Myers is facing a difficult decision. Francois's mother is Liliane Bettencourt, heiress and major shareholder of the cosmetic giant L'Oreal. With a net worth of over 20 billion euros, Liliane is the wealthiest woman in the world. But at 88 years old, her mental condition has seriously declined, and she doesn't seem to notice people scamming her out of billions of euros. One man, an eccentric French photographer, is close to stealing everything she owns. Everything Francois stands to inherit, but she has a plan to stop him. In Francois's desk are 25 CDs worth of secret tape recordings that could prove her mother is being taken advantage of. But they have so much more. The tapes also contain her family's dark history, her mother's tax evasion schemes, and even potential evidence of the President of France accepting bribes. So the question is, does she release them? Doing so would expose the inner workings of her ultra-rich family, unleash a decade-long media storm, and have profound consequences for the French political elite. But Francois is concerned for her mother, desperate to protect her fortune and out for revenge. She releases the tapes.
Son ami depuis 20 ans, le photographe François-Marie Bagnier.
Vous m'imaginez venant à un dîner et repartant avec de l'argent?
Qu'importe, on est très généreux, on est trop généreux, et puis merde.
Je mène un combat pour protéger ma mère.
The story begins in 1907 with a young French chemist named Eugene Schuler, who would change the beauty industry forever. At the time, hair dye was usually made at home, using harmful chemicals like lead. However, Schuler created a mixture that used metallic salts, which dyed hair faster, with more consistent, vivid colors, and all without risking anyone's health. The product was a hit, and so Schuler set up the French harmless hair dye company, and he rebranded as L'Oreal. Schuler's new dyes spread quickly across Europe, then to the rest of the world. And as he created more products such as color enhancers, cold wave perms, makeup, skincare products, and acquired dozens of competitors in the cosmetics industry, L'Oreal became one of Europe's largest companies, a global multi-billion euro conglomerate. Schuler became one of the wealthiest men in France, and when he passed away in 1957, the entire L'Oreal fortune went to his daughter, Liliane, who inherited the vast majority of the company's shares. However, Liliane was never involved in the business. Instead, she was a socialite of the French upper class. At 28, she married a wealthy ex-minister, a man named André Bettencourt, and they had a daughter, Francois. From the outside, anyone would have envied Liliane's lifestyle. She had 20 personal servants in her Paris mansion, luxurious properties all across the world, and was worth tens of billions of euros. To her, money was as abundant as air. But for all the lavishness and grandeur, Liliane's life was rather lonely. As often happens with the ultra-rich, people are more interested in their money than their friendship. Liliane's husband was not very interested in her either. They slept in separate rooms and hardly ever spoke. And with her daughter Francois, the relationship was tense. Francois was introverted and discreet. She completely rejected the superficial lifestyle of French high society her mother was so used to, and thus Liliane felt uneasy thinking Francois would inherit the L'Oreal fortune. They were family, but to say the least, Liliane and Francois didn't get along. And so, because of her superficial social life, her dispassionate marriage, and her contentious relationship with Francois, Liliane often suffered from prolonged periods of intense depression, despite her endless billions. But when Liliane was 55 and wealthier than ever, that all changed. In 1987, a high-profile magazine asked her to collaborate on a piece about her. Liliane agreed. They needed a few pictures, and little did anyone know her photographer would cause shockwaves in her life, her family, and all of France. From the moment François-Marie Bonnier drove into the Bettencourt mansion, parked his bike on a flower garden, and urinated on the roses, life was never the same for Liliane Bettencourt. Initially, Bonnier repulsed her. He was vulgar, bad-mannered, and during their photo shoot, he didn't hesitate to let her know he was disgusted by her sense of fashion. But on the other hand, Liliane was used to being treated like royalty, and Bonnier was unlike anyone she'd ever met. He was disrespectful, but also clever and talented. He did a stellar job on Liliane's photographs, and days later she invited him back. Bonnier was openly gay and 25 years younger than Liliane, but he seduced her all the same. Slowly but surely, Liliane lowered her guard, and a single photo shoot turned into a decades-long friendship. Bonnier made her laugh. He made her talk about books. He introduced her to interesting actors, artists, and writers, and they traveled together. For the first time in her life, Liliane didn't feel alone. She felt alive. Bonnier became Liliane's best friend in the world, but friendship at the heights of wealth is always complicated. In 1999, 77 years old and still owning around 30% of L'Oreal, Liliane was already the wealthiest woman in the world, and she acted like it, especially around Bonnier. Liliane would often buy works of art that cost hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars, and just give them to him as gifts, or in legal terms, donations. For Liliane, this was like dropping a penny on the side of the road, but she felt like she owed Bonnier. His friendship saved her life, so she paid him back the only way she knew how, with money. However, as the dollar amounts of Liliane's donations rose year by year, her daughter started getting suspicious. Ever since she met him, François had never trusted Bonnier. And one day in 2007, all her instincts proved right. Bonnier always talked about how little he cared about money, but according to Liliane's personal accountant, his actions told a completely different story. Every day before Liliane was supposed to see Bonnier, he would call to make sure she didn't leave without her checkbook. And when she came back, there were checks worth hundreds of thousands of euros missing. Bonnier would also ask the accountant to transfer up to 3 million euros to his bank accounts. Another time, Liliane asked her accountant to withdraw her entire collection of jewelry, worth tens of millions, from her bank safe. The accountant knew Bonnier had asked for it, and she resisted. She begged Liliane not to give it away, but she was her boss, and Bonnier ultimately got the gems. When François and the accountant checked the records, they could not believe what they found. Between 1997 and 2007, Liliane had given Bonnier 917 million euros worth of art, jewelry, and cash. And on top of that, she had made him the beneficiary of 2 life insurance policies collectively worth over 500 million euros. Imagine giving away nearly €1 billion and not noticing. Sure, you can blame Bonnier for being deceptive, but honestly, this whole fraud could have been avoided if the Bettencourts simply used the sponsor of this video, Odoo Accounting. Odoo is the all-in-one platform that makes running your business feel effortless. Their suite of apps is designed to streamline everything, from setting up your website to managing your team and tracking your expenses. Odoo's accounting app integrates seamlessly with over 28,000 banks from around the world, and it gives you real-time financial dashboards, simplifies your taxes, and even uses AI to keep track of invoices for you. Keep track of the payment status from the dashboard, knowing what's paid or unpaid. With AI-powered invoice digitization, you can upload bills just by scanning the bills with 98% accuracy. You just have to validate. With synchronized bank feed, bank statements are updated every 4 hours. And with over 70 localization packages, Odoo Accounting is ready to match your country's needs. So you can spend less time on paperwork and more time growing your business. Plus, with Odoo's automated financial reports, you can actually see where your money is going before it ends up funding someone else's private art collection. So you can rest easy knowing your money is safe. And as your business grows, Odoo grows with you. You can start with their accounting app and add other tools like sales, inventory, or marketing whenever you need them. Everything works together seamlessly, and the best part is that your first app is free forever. So if you're ready to stop stressing over spreadsheets and start managing your business with confidence, click the top link in the description to get started today. There was no doubt in Francois's mind anymore. Bonnier was taking advantage of her mother, but she was completely under his spell. That year, things finally reached their limit. In November, Liliane's husband passed away. Bonnier was at the funeral, and that night, he stayed at the mansion to comfort her. When it was late, one of the servants was cleaning a bathroom when she overheard a conversation between them. At Liliane's most vulnerable moment of grief, Bonnier told her he wanted to be the son she never had. He asked her to officially adopt him, and she said yes. When Francois heard the story, it was her breaking point. If her mother adopted Bonnier, he'd be entitled to half the entire L'Oréal fortune, which was her inheritance. But more than that, she was furious that Bonnier dared to consider himself part of her family. And so Francois wrote a letter to her mother saying, "It's unbearable to imagine someone claiming to be a friend abusing you." And the next day, she filed an official police complaint against Bonnier, claiming he'd exploited her mother's psychological weakness for his own gain. And that was an attack on both of them. You see, over the years, Francois had noticed that sometimes when she was tired, her mother would forget the date or some obvious fact like that. As a last resort to protect her inheritance, she was forced to claim that her mother's mental condition had deteriorated. And since the police complaint would eventually lead to a trial, it meant that if Francois won, Liliane would lose her legal right to make decisions, and Bonnier would likely go to prison. So for now, Liliane could only adopt Bonnier if a jury found that he wasn't abusing her, which means the police started an official investigation. But at the same time, Francois took things into her own hands. She constantly asked the staff at Liliane's mansion to testify against Bonnier, and the atmosphere there was tense. Liliane immediately fired anyone who helped Francois in the past, like her accountant, and if she caught anyone else, she did not hesitate to fire them either. She even had the mansion check for hidden microphones, but although she didn't find anything, someone had already spent months secretly recording her. In May 2010, Liliane's butler contacted Francois and gave her 25 CDs. The butler had been Liliane's loyal employee for decades. He was genuinely concerned she was being exploited and wanted to help prove it. So whenever Liliane met with her asset manager, he would bring them food and drinks in a rolling tray, make some light small talk, and leave them talking business. Little did they know there was a recorder neatly tucked away below the tablecloth. So over the past few months, the butler had recorded 21 hours worth of her meetings without raising any eyebrows. However, he couldn't possibly have predicted what he would find. When Francois heard the recordings, it was obvious they could prove Bonnier was taking advantage of her mother. But they had so much more. Her family's dark history, how Liliane had avoided paying hundreds of millions in taxes, and even potential evidence that the current president of France and dozens of other politicians had taken bribes from the Bettencourt family. Now, Francois only cared about Bonnier, but she couldn't just release the parts of the recordings that helped her case. It was either all or nothing, so she was faced with a choice. Making the recordings public would mean the end of her privacy, turning Liliane into an anti-Semitic white-collar criminal, and potentially targeting some of the most powerful people in France. But Francois had to protect her mother, and she couldn't bear the thought of giving Bonnier half of her inheritance, let alone calling him a brother. No. Her peace of mind, her mother's image, and the political stability of France were irrelevant. On June 16, 2010, Francois went to the French authorities and released the recordings. What followed was a complete and utter scandal. When Francois first heard the recordings, she quickly realized that her mother's abuse went beyond just Bonnier. Liliane was so incredibly wealthy that some of her house staff simply asked her to double their already generous salaries. And she did. No questions asked. She also bought her nurse and her bodyguard luxurious penthouses in the center of Paris and gave the chairman of L'Oréal 100 million euros. But of course, Bonnier was the worst of them all. A few years back, he got Liliane to change her will, entitling him to a private island worth over 50 million euros, and officially naming him as her sole heir. Liliane's L'Oréal stock was already entrusted to Francois, but still, this meant Bagné would be getting everything else, billions worth of assets. Now, Liliane had the right to do all of this. It was her money. The problem, as the recordings revealed, was that she wasn't completely aware that she had done it. She didn't remember giving away any apartments, and she didn't remember giving Bagné the island or making him her sole heir. Clearly, something was going on with her, so when the courts heard the recordings, they ordered Liliane to get a psychiatric exam, and the conclusion was undeniable. She was suffering from early-onset Alzheimer's disease. Francois's theory was right. Her mother wasn't fit to make her own decisions, and this changed everything about the case. Before, it was just a dispute between Francois and Bagné, but now it became about dozens of people taking advantage of a vulnerable, elderly woman. Because of this, Bagné's case became part of a much larger police investigation, and his trial was delayed. Francois would have to wait for him to face justice, but either way, people's attention was on something much bigger. You see, Francois had released the tapes to stop Bagné from stealing her inheritance, but in reality, only a tiny fraction of the recordings had anything to do with him. The public was much more concerned with the rest of what the tapes contained, not least of which was the dark history of the Bettencourt family. Liliane's father, the founder of L'Oréal, was a brilliant chemist and a world-class entrepreneur, but his legacy is not exactly pristine. In the 1940s, he was a founding member of a fascist movement, and he's believed to have funded an anti-Semitic far-right organization known for executing Italian anti-fascists. When the Germans occupied Paris, he willingly did business with them, so World War II did nothing but fuel L'Oréal's growth. Unfortunately, some of her father's viewpoints had rubbed off on Liliane, and they were especially pronounced when it came to Francois's marriage. Francois's husband came from a long line of rabbis, and when they had children, they decided to raise them Jewish. Liliane resented her for this, and as the recordings revealed, she often made anti-Semitic remarks when talking about Francois's family. One time, Liliane's asset manager met her oldest grandson.
So I was next to your grandson.
Is he handsome?
Yes.
Elegant?
Yes.
Not too Jewish.
Ultimately, this just led to the public having a more negative perception of the Bettencourt family. But in reality, the backlash from this was tiny compared to the rest of what the recordings revealed. Around the time Liliane's butler began secretly recording her conversations with her asset manager, France was in the middle of a historic crackdown on tax evasion. For decades, Switzerland had been one of the most impenetrable tax havens in Europe. Swiss banks didn't have to disclose who their clients were, how much money they had, or where it came from. And because of this, thousands of wealthy Europeans used Swiss banks to hide money from their local tax authorities. Among this group, of course, was the world's wealthiest woman, Liliane Bettencourt. But in 2010, the French government was about to pass a law that forced people to declare their Swiss bank accounts and how much money they had in them. For Liliane, this was a massive threat. As the recordings revealed, she held hundreds of millions of euros in a number of Swiss bank accounts. So once this law passed, she would have to pay a massive wealth tax. However, Liliane's asset manager was on top of the situation. If they moved the money out of Switzerland before the law passed, Liliane wouldn't have to pay tax, and the French government would be none the wiser. A few weeks later, all of her Swiss money was safely stored in Singapore. It was blatant tax fraud. But it didn't stop there. In the recordings, Liliane and her asset manager mentioned at least 12 different bank accounts in tax havens everywhere from Hong Kong to Uruguay. That private island mentioned in her will, it was held by an anonymous trust in Liechtenstein and never declared to the French government either. When the tapes were released, French tax authorities launched an investigation and uncovered the full extent of Liliane's fraud. In total, she had evaded taxes amounting to over 108 million euros. That is serious money. So to avoid prison time, Liliane had to repatriate all of it and pay some hefty fines, although for a woman as wealthy as her, those were just a drop in the bucket. But still, the question remained, how had she gotten away with this for so many years? Well, between the tape recordings and the media storm surrounding the scandal, a story was slowly taking shape. And it looked like the very people helping Liliane avoid taxes were the highest officials in the French government. One of the people at the forefront of this scandal was Liliane's ex-accountant, who she'd fired for helping gather evidence against Bagné. Now, a major French newspaper was asking for her side of the story, and when the article was released, it shook the foundations of French politics. In the article, the accountant claimed that Liliane hadn't gotten a single tax audit in over 13 years, which seemed incredibly odd, until you listen to the recordings. Then the reason is all but obvious. At the time, France was in the middle of a historic crackdown on tax evasion, and the man leading this effort was Budget Minister Eric Worth. Among other things, he was responsible for pushing the new law that regulated the use of Swiss bank accounts, but at the same time, Worth's wife worked for Liliane's asset manager on Liliane's finances, and they evaded taxes precisely by using Swiss bank accounts. Obviously, this was a huge conflict of interest, but aside from that, it didn't look great when during one of their recorded meetings, Liliane's asset manager told her that Worth was, quote, taking care of her taxes. To corroborate this, the accountant claimed that Worth was fully aware of Liliane's tax evasion scheme, and even worse, that he had aided in it. Now, Worth was one of the highest-ranking officers of the French government, but really, he was just the tip of the iceberg. In the article, the accountant claimed that Liliane had the entire French political class in her pocket. According to her, Liliane routinely hosted luxurious parties where she invited dozens of politicians. Before they arrived, though, Liliane told the accountant to prepare envelopes with tens of thousands of euros so she could give them out to the guests. Now, making political donations isn't illegal in France, but it is illegal to make contributions above 7,500 euros in cash without reporting them to the government. And it didn't matter if you were a conservative, a liberal, a nationalist, or a socialist, Liliane funded everyone. The politicians got her money, and she got their influence. This was an accusation of widespread corruption throughout the entire French political system. But everyone's attention was pointed toward one man, the current president of France, Nicolas Sarkozy. In the article, the accountant claimed that Sarkozy was a regular at the Bettencourt mansion. He always asked Liliane for cash, and she always gave it to him. But the landmark accusation was that back when Sarkozy was running for president, Liliane secretly gave Eric Worth, who was also treasurer of Sarkozy's party, 150,000 euros in cash to fund the campaign, which of course was completely illegal. If this was true, Sarkozy's entire presidency was illegitimate. He would have to step down. So as you can imagine, this article sent the whole of France into a panic. Worth and Sarkozy immediately claimed that this was a political attack and denied every accusation.
Ils n'ont pas parlé de moi, ça a été donc. Ça a été mentionné. Ça a été donc un mensonge de plus. Un mensonge de plus.
But despite their efforts, they weren't able to control the narrative. Protests broke out in the streets of Paris, and within a few weeks, Sarkozy's approval rating dropped from 65% to 32%, the lowest a French president had ever received at the time. However, the article did make one mistake. It claimed that the accountant could confirm that Sarkozy had received 150,000 euros. What she had really said was that she had given the cash to Liliane's asset manager, who told her it was meant for Sarkozy's campaign. But she really couldn't say what Liliane's asset manager did with the money. And since cash transactions leave no trace, there was no evidence to prove that Sarkozy ever got the money. Either way, due to the gravity of the accountant's statement, French authorities had to investigate further. But when they took the accountant in for questioning, something odd happened. Before the police released her, they interrogated the accountant not once, not twice, but 18 separate times. They treated her like a criminal, and likely because she was exhausted. There were some inconsistencies in her statements. For example, sometimes she said she withdrew the cash from the bank, and sometimes she said she withdrew it from the bank safe. These were small discrepancies, but they were enough to force her to retract parts of her statement. So, given these inconsistencies and the lack of concrete evidence of a cash transaction, it seemed like the police stopped investigating President Sarkozy's alleged corruption. But behind the scenes, this couldn't be farther from the truth. The case was anything but over. For now, though, the media turned its attention to another side of this story. For the first time in 3 years, Francois and Liliane Bettencourt were meeting in person to resolve their differences once and for all. Or maybe Francois was planning something else entirely. Francois hadn't spoken to Liliane in over 3 years, but in December 2010, they finally agreed to end their family feud. Now, every negotiation has some give and take, but this one had a clear winner. For her part, Francois agreed to withdraw her police complaint against Bonnier, but in exchange, Liliane agreed to permanently distance herself from him. She agreed to fire her asset manager and replace him with Francois' husband, and she agreed to be placed under guardianship, which meant she lost control of the L'Oréal fortune and forfeited the right to make her own legal decisions. It was extremely unbalanced, but the strangest thing is that Liliane's lawyer wasn't there, and that creates a litany of issues. First of all, Francois had been arguing that her mother wasn't mentally fit to make her own legal decisions for years now. So getting her to sign a life-changing document without her lawyer was a huge contradiction. According to that lawyer, this settlement was the exact opposite of what Liliane actually wanted, which raises the possibility that Francois took advantage of her mother just like everyone else. And most confusing of all, by signing this settlement, Liliane was basically making the legal decision that she wasn't able to make legal decisions. It was a paradoxical, controversial settlement, and nobody knows how Francois got her mother to agree to it. But with just a simple signature, Liliane basically gave her freedom away. From now on, Francois practically controlled every aspect of her mother's life, from who she was allowed to see to where she lived. But maybe this was the only way to protect her. Either way, in the following months, the press reduced their coverage of this whole affair. After turning into a larger investigation, Bannier's case was still awaiting a trial date, and there hadn't been any new developments in the political scandal involving President Sarkozy. In fact, in 2012, Sarkozy's reputation had somewhat recovered, and he was confidently running for re-election. Little did he know, though, his investigation was never closed. 2 months before the ballots opened, the French judiciary brought Liliane's former asset manager in to testify about the case. Obviously, he didn't admit to giving the president 150,000 euros cash, but this new investigation shined a spotlight on Sarkozy's alleged corruption again, and his reputation took another massive hit. This ultimately lost him the election, which was a big problem. Being president gave Sarkozy some special legal protections, but now that he was a regular citizen, the judiciary was free to take him to trial. Proving him guilty, though, another thing. The main accusation against Sarkozy was that throughout his political career, he had received cash donations from Liliane, including a 150,000 euro contribution to fund his 2007 presidential campaign, which was, of course, completely illegal. As for evidence, though, there was inconsistent testimony from Liliane's ex-accountant, a handwritten ledger citing a cash withdrawal for 50,000 euros around the alleged date of the transaction, and an entry from Bannier's journal which said Liliane confessed to him that Sarkozy asked her for money, quote, again, and that she said yes. Now, none of this paints a pretty picture for Sarkozy, but it wasn't enough to prove that the cash transaction actually took place. Eventually, the judiciary had to dismiss the case. Sarkozy was off the hook, at least for now. At this point, the only remaining loose thread in this whole Bettencourt affair was the eccentric French photographer who had started it all, François-Marie Bannier. In 2015, he, along with ex-President Sarkozy, ex-Labor Minister Eric Woerth, and 5 other defendants were tried for taking advantage of the wealthiest woman on the planet. Sarkozy and Woerth were both released from the charges, but the evidence against Bannier was overwhelming. It turns out this wasn't even the first time he'd taken advantage of an elderly woman for his own financial gain. So in the end, he was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison, fined 350,000 euros, and ordered to compensate Francois with 158 million euros. Francois had been waiting years for this victory, but unfortunately for her, this is not the end of the story. Immediately after the verdict, Bannier appealed the decision and got a new trial a year later. His verdict remained the same, guilty, but his sentence was significantly reduced. Instead of 2.5 years behind bars, he got a 4-year suspended sentence outside of prison. His fine was increased from 350,000 euros to 375,000 euros, but instead of 158 million euros in compensation to Francois, he only had to pay her the staggering amount of 1 single euro. Liliane Bettencourt died in 2017 at 94 years old. Her daughter Francois inherited her fortune, and she is currently the wealthiest woman in the world, the first one ever to be worth over $100 billion. Ever since his retrial, François-Marie Bagné has continued his career as a celebrity photographer. He recently told his life story through a memoir entitled Interrupted Dialogues. In 2021, former President Nicolas Sarkozy was found guilty of spending nearly twice the legal limit on his 2012 presidential campaign. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison, which was reduced to 6 months in house arrest and 6 months suspended. He appealed the decision and is scheduled to face trial again in 2025. Sarkozy will also stand trial over allegations that he received 50 million euros from Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi for his 2007 presidential campaign. Despite these legal troubles, Sarkozy remains an influential figure in French politics. When Francois released Liliane's secret tape recordings back in 2016, she understood it would have consequences beyond just her gripes with her mother and Bagné. But how could she have known that it would lead to all of this?